Hey there, welcome to Dread Lullabies. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. You know, they say the night is for resting, but for some, the darkness is where the real world begins. Tonight, I've put together a few true stories that are meant to be heard in the quiet. Stories that remind us that sometimes the things that go bump in the night are more real than we'd like to believe. Before we get lost in the dark, I'd love to know where you're joining me from. So feel free to drop a comment and tell me where you're listening tonight. And if you find yourself coming back for more, maybe consider liking the video and subscribing. It really helps me keep these lullabies going for you. So, pull up the covers, get comfortable, and let's see what the night has in store for us. When I was in high school, there was always a rumor floating around that the building was haunted. It wasn't the kind of story that just one student told to scare others. It was something people talked about quietly, almost like a piece of school folklore that had existed long before we got there. Every new group of students eventually heard the same thing. Strange sounds in empty hallways, doors moving when no one was around, lights flickering in the older parts of the building. What made the stories feel a little more believable was the way some of the teachers acted. A few of them openly admitted that they didn't like staying in the building alone after dark. If they had late grading or meetings, they often left in small groups. Some teachers would wait in the parking lot for another teacher to finish up before walking out together. Now, as students, we found that interesting. Teachers were supposed to be the calm, rational adults in the building, so seeing them act cautious about something made the rumors feel more serious. Our school itself was fairly old. Parts of the building had clearly been added over time. The newer sections were brighter, with wide hallways and modern classrooms. But the older areas were different. The floors creaked in certain places. The walls were thicker, the ceilings lower, and the lighting had that dim yellow tone that older buildings often have. My locker happened to be in one of those older sections. One winter evening, something happened that I still think about from time to time. It was during basketball season, and we had a practice that ran later than usual. By the time we finished, most of the students had already gone home. The gym lights were still on, but the rest of the building had grown quiet. After practice, I was gathering my things when I suddenly realized that I had left some books in my locker. I needed them for homework that night. At first, I thought about just leaving them there and dealing with it the next day, but I knew that would only make things harder later, so I decided to run upstairs quickly and grab them. The hallway outside the gym still had a few people in it. A couple of teammates were talking, and a coach was packing up equipment. That part of the building still felt normal and active. But as soon as I turned toward the older wing where my locker was located, things felt different. The hallway grew quieter with every step. The lights were dimmer, and there were long stretches where I didn't see anyone else at all. I told myself it was normal. After all, practice had run late. Most students had already left the building. When I reached the stairwell that led to the older hallway, I noticed something odd. The lights at the top of the stairs weren't on. Usually the motion sensors would trigger them as soon as someone walked up the stairs. But this time, nothing happened. The hallway above was dark. I climbed the stairs anyway. When I reached the top, I tried the light switch on the wall, but the lights still didn't come on. I stood there for a moment, staring down the dark hallway. At that point, the logical part of my brain told me it was probably just a maintenance issue. Maybe those lights had been turned off earlier by the custodial staff. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness just enough to illuminate a small section of the hallway ahead of me. The lockers along the walls reflected the light slightly, creating long shadows on the floor. The older part of the building had a different sound to it. Every step echoed a little more. The air felt still, almost heavy. I walked slowly toward my locker, the beam of light moving back and forth across the metal doors as I passed them. When I reached my locker, I set my bag down and started working the combination lock. The metal clicked loudly in the quiet hallway. I had just opened the door and reached in for my books when I heard something behind me. A door creaked open. It wasn't loud, but in the silence of the hallway it sounded very clear. I turned my head slowly and pointed my phone's flashlight down the hall. About 20 feet away, one of the classroom doors had swung open slightly. The door itself looked normal. There was no one standing in the doorway. No light came from inside the room. The classroom beyond was completely dark. For a moment, I stood there trying to figure out what I had just seen. Maybe a teacher had been in there and left quietly. Maybe someone else was in the hallway that I hadn't noticed. But as I looked around, the hallway appeared completely empty. I told myself not to overthink it. I turned back to my locker and grabbed the books I needed. I stuffed them into my bag and closed the locker door. That's when the second sound came. The classroom door slammed shut. It wasn't a soft click. It was a sharp, sudden slam that echoed down the hallway. I turned around again, shining my phone's light toward the door. It was closed now, still no one in sight. The hallway was silent again. At that point, I felt the first real wave of unease. It wasn't full panic, but it was enough to make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I picked up my bag and started walking back toward the stairwell. Halfway down the hallway, another sound broke the silence. A locker door slammed shut behind me, then another one. I stopped walking and turned around quickly. In the narrow beam of my phone's flashlight, I saw a row of lockers. A few of them were slightly open, just enough to catch the light. Then one of them slammed shut. The sound echoed sharply. Before I could even process it, another locker door banged open farther down the hall. Then it slammed shut again. The sounds began to follow me, one after another. The locker doors opened and slammed shut somewhere behind me as I started walking faster toward the stairs. My heart started pounding. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe air pressure from the ventilation system. Maybe loose locker doors shifting in the cold. But the timing felt too deliberate. Every time I moved a few steps, another slam echoed behind me. I stopped once more and turned around fully, raising my phone's light as high as I could. The hallway looked empty. Rows of lockers, closed classroom doors, nothing moving. But as soon as I turned back around and started walking again, another locker door slammed behind me. That was the moment I decided I had had enough. I grabbed my bag tighter and started running. My footsteps echoed loudly in the empty hallway. The flashlight beam bounced across the walls as I moved faster toward the stairs. Behind me, I could still hear doors and lockers slamming open and shut. Each sound seemed to chase me down the hallway. I didn't look back again. I ran down the stairs and straight toward the gym area where the lights were still on. As soon as I reached the brighter hallway near the gym, the sounds stopped. The gym doors were open, and a few people were still inside talking and gathering their things. The normal noise of voices and movement immediately made the whole experience feel distant. I slowed down, trying to catch my breath. One of my teammates looked at me and asked why I looked so pale. I didn't even know what to say. Part of me wanted to tell them exactly what had happened. Another part of me was already trying to convince myself that there had to be a normal explanation. Old buildings make strange noises sometimes. Air systems shift pressure. Metal lockers expand and contract in the cold. Those are all perfectly reasonable explanations. But even now, when I remember that walk down the dark hallway, the sequence of sounds feels too deliberate to dismiss easily. The creaking door, the sudden slam, the lockers opening and shutting behind me as I walked away. I never stayed late in that part of the building again after that night. And whenever people talked about the school being haunted, I didn't laugh the way I used to, because sometimes the memory of that empty hallway still comes back to me, along with the sound of those locker doors slamming one after another behind me. When I was very young, probably around 1 or 2 years old, my parents and I lived in a small house in a neighborhood that did not have the best reputation. I personally do not remember the place because I was too little at the time. But over the years, my parents told this story so many times that it feels almost like a memory now. Even though I did not experience it consciously, the thought of what happened that night has always stayed with me. The house itself was simple. It was not large or fancy, just a small place that my parents could afford while they were trying to build their lives. They were young and doing their best with what they had. The house sat right on the corner of a 4-way stop. Because of that, there was a stop sign planted right in front of the house, near the curb. During the day, it probably looked completely ordinary, just another street corner like thousands of others. But at night, in neighborhoods where things can sometimes get a little rough, places like that can attract the wrong kind of attention. My parents told me the area could be unpredictable after dark. Sometimes you heard shouting from down the street, sometimes loud cars, sometimes noises that made you stop and listen for a moment. It was not constant chaos, but it was the kind of place where people learned not to be surprised by strange sounds in the middle of the night. Inside the house, life was simple. My parents had their bedroom and my crib was in another room. The walls were thin, the floors creaked a little when someone walked across them, and the windows rattled slightly when trucks passed by outside. Still, it was home. My parents were focused on raising a child and making the best life they could. One night, long after everyone had gone to sleep, something happened that they would remember for the rest of their lives. My parents were both asleep in their bed when they were suddenly jolted awake by a loud noise. It was the kind of sharp, cracking sound that slices through the quiet of the night and pulls you instantly out of sleep. According to them, they both woke up at almost the exact same moment. The sound was unmistakable. It was a gunshot. Hearing something like that would frighten most people, but in that particular neighborhood, it was not completely unheard of. My parents told me that at first they stayed very still, listening carefully. When you wake up suddenly like that, your brain takes a few seconds to understand what is happening. They tried to figure out where the sound came from and whether there were any other noises that followed. But after a moment, the night went quiet again. There were no sirens immediately afterward, no shouting outside, no sounds of cars speeding away. Everything returned to the same still silence that had been there before. They looked around the room, listened for another minute, and then tried to reason it out. The sound had seemed like it came from outside somewhere. It had not sounded like anything inside the house had broken. In that neighborhood, hearing a gunshot somewhere down the street was not impossible. Eventually, they convinced themselves that it was probably something happening somewhere else nearby. After all, nothing else seemed out of place. They checked briefly that everything inside the house looked normal, and then, after a while, they went back to sleep. The rest of the night passed quietly. The next morning began like any other. The sun came through the windows, the house looked calm, and there was no obvious sign that anything unusual had happened. It was just another day. At some point that morning, my mom went into the bathroom. While she was standing there, she noticed something strange on the wall. There was a small hole that she did not remember seeing before. At first, she probably thought it was just some damage in the wall that she had never noticed. Old houses can have small imperfections like that, but when she looked closer, she realized something was different. The hole went all the way through. It was not a crack or a dent. It was a clean hole straight through the wall. That immediately caught her attention. She leaned in closer and looked at it again, trying to understand what could have caused something like that. She called my dad to come look at it. When he came into the bathroom, they both started examining the wall more carefully. And that was when the situation started becoming much more unsettling. There was not just one hole, there were several. As they followed the line of damage through the house, they discovered that the holes lined up perfectly from one wall to another. There was a hole in the bathroom wall, another in the next wall along the same path, and another further down. It looked like something had passed through the house in a straight line. That was the moment when the realization began to sink in. The loud sound they had heard during the night suddenly made a lot more sense. My dad continued checking along the path of the holes, moving from one room to another, trying to see where the line ended. Eventually, he found the bullet itself. It had traveled through several walls before finally losing enough force to stop somewhere inside the house. After looking at the direction and angle, the explanation became clear. Someone outside had fired a gun at the stop sign on the corner. The bullet struck the metal sign and ricocheted. Instead of stopping there, it changed direction and shot straight toward the house. It passed through the outer wall, then continued through the bedroom wall, then through the bathroom wall, and kept traveling until it finally slowed down and stopped inside. In other words, a random bullet fired by someone messing around outside had gone straight through the house while my entire family was asleep inside. When my parents realized that, the full weight of the situation must have hit them. They had been sleeping only a few feet away while a bullet traveled through the walls of their home. If either of them had been standing up at that moment, the bullet might have struck them. If someone had gotten up to use the bathroom during the night, the outcome could have been completely different. Even though I was just a baby in my crib, the idea that a bullet had passed through the house while we were all sleeping is enough to make anyone's heart skip. Sometimes danger passes through our lives without us even realizing it. That night, my parents heard a sound and assumed it came from somewhere down the street. They had no idea that the bullet had actually entered the house and passed through multiple rooms while they slept. It was not until daylight revealed the holes in the walls that the truth became clear. My dad kept the bullet for a while as a reminder of what had happened. It was just a small piece of metal, but it represented something much bigger. It showed how close a random act of recklessness had come to causing serious harm. The more they thought about it, the more uncomfortable they felt living there. The neighborhood had already been a little rough, but this incident pushed them to a decision. Hearing about trouble in the area is one thing. Finding out that a stray bullet passed through your home while your family slept is something else entirely. Not long after that, my parents decided it was time to move. They did not want to raise a child in a place where something like that could happen again. They knew they had been lucky that time, but luck is not something you want to rely on when it comes to safety. So they packed up and found another place to live. Even though I was too young to remember the event firsthand, the story has always stayed with me. It is one of those moments that reminds you how unpredictable life can be. A random decision made by someone outside, someone firing a gun at a stop sign for fun, could have changed everything for my family. Maybe it is not the kind of story people usually call creepy, but it definitely has the kind of twist that makes your heart pause when you think about it. Because sometimes the scariest things are not the ones that happen. Sometimes they are the ones that almost do. About 4 years ago, I went on a cruise with my best friend. It was one of those trips we had been talking about for a long time. We were both excited because it felt like a chance to escape normal life for a while and just enjoy ourselves. The cruise was headed through parts of Mexico, and we planned to make the most of every stop. From the moment we boarded the ship, everything felt exciting and overwhelming in a good way. Cruise ships are like floating cities. There are restaurants, casinos, music playing in different parts of the ship, and people from everywhere moving around constantly. It feels like there is always something happening no matter what time it is. During the days, we explored the ports whenever the ship docked. We shopped in small markets, tried local food, and took pictures everywhere. So the weather was warm and the ocean looked endless in every direction. At night, we would head back onto the ship and join the crowds moving between the bars, the casino, and the clubs. We were young, on vacation, and not really thinking about limits. There was a lot of partying involved. Drinks were easy to get, and the atmosphere encouraged people to relax and let loose. Some nights we stayed up until early morning just wandering around the ship with drinks in our hands, laughing about random things and meeting people we would probably never see again. One night stands out more than the others. We had been drinking heavily that evening. I had way more vodka than I should have, and by the time we got back to our room, I was completely exhausted. Our cabin had a small patio door that opened to a balcony overlooking the ocean. It was one of those sliding glass doors that are heavy and designed to shut firmly. I remember collapsing into bed and falling asleep almost immediately. Sometime later, probably around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. It wasn't the kind of slow waking where you stretch and roll over. It was like my eyes just opened out of nowhere in the middle of a deep sleep. The room was dark except for a faint light coming from outside, through the balcony door. What caught my attention right away was that the patio door was open. That immediately confused me. On cruise ships, those doors are heavy. When you close them, you usually have to push them firmly until they slam shut and lock. They don't normally just slide open on their own. I looked across the room and saw that my friend was still asleep in her bed. I was half awake and still foggy from the alcohol, but something about it seemed strange. I got up, walked over to the door, and pulled it closed. It made the familiar heavy sound when it shut and locked. Even in my sleepy state, I remember thinking it was odd, but I was too tired to think about it much. I climbed back into bed and almost immediately fell asleep again. I don't know how much time passed after that. At some point later that night, I woke up again just as suddenly as before. The room looked the same as it had earlier, dark, quiet, with faint light filtering in from outside. But this time, something was different. There was a figure standing at the end of my bed. At first, my brain struggled to understand what I was looking at. I thought I might still be dreaming because the image seemed so strange. But my eyes were open and I could clearly see the room around me. The figure looked like a man. He appeared mangled and bloodied, standing there with his head tilted to one side in an unnatural angle. His posture looked wrong, almost broken. The way his head leaned made it look like his neck was bent or damaged. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, staring at me. For a moment, I convinced myself that I must still be dreaming. Sometimes when you wake up suddenly, your mind mixes dreams with reality. I blinked a few times, expecting the image to disappear, but when I opened my eyes again, he was still there. That was the moment fear hit me. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I felt frozen in place. I couldn't process what I was seeing. Everything in my mind was telling me it wasn't possible. Yet I could see it clearly in front of me. My reaction probably sounds ridiculous, but it was the only thing I could think of in that moment. I pulled the blanket over my head and covered myself completely, as if hiding under the blanket would somehow protect me. I lay there perfectly still, breathing slowly and trying not to panic. Part of me hoped that if I ignored it, whatever it was would go away. Eventually, somehow, I forced myself back to sleep. When morning came, sunlight filled the cabin and everything looked completely normal again. The ocean was visible through the balcony. The room looked exactly as it had the day before, and there was no sign of anything unusual. I was still lying there processing the memory when my friend woke up. Before I could say anything about what I had experienced, she told me something strange had happened during the night. She said she had woken up at one point and noticed that the bathroom light was on and the faucet was running. That immediately made me sit up. She asked if I had gotten up during the night to use the bathroom and left the water running. I told her I hadn't. I had only gotten up once to close the balcony door. Then I told her about the figure I had seen at the end of my bed. As I explained it, I could hear how unbelievable it sounded. I had never had any kind of paranormal experience before. I wasn't someone who believed strongly in ghosts or supernatural events, but I knew what I had seen. My friend was just as unsettled hearing it as I had been experiencing it. The rest of the trip went on normally. We continued enjoying the cruise, going to shows, eating at restaurants, and visiting ports. But that night stayed in the back of my mind the entire time. When we finally returned home and the trip was over, curiosity got the better of me. I started searching online to see if anyone had ever reported strange experiences on that ship. To my surprise, I found a lot of stories. People had posted about unusual things happening on board. Some described hearing footsteps in empty hallways late at night. Others talked about lights turning on or objects moving in their cabins. A few stories mentioned sightings of figures or shadows that disappeared quickly. I also learned that over the years there had been multiple incidents involving people falling overboard or committing suicide on cruise ships in general. Being out at sea, isolated from land, can create a strange atmosphere that affects people in different ways. Reading those accounts gave me chills. I still don't know what I experienced that night. It could have been something explainable. Alcohol, exhaustion, and being in an unfamiliar environment can affect sleep patterns and cause very vivid hallucinations or sleep paralysis episodes. When you wake up suddenly in the middle of the night, the brain sometimes hasn't fully transitioned out of dream mode. That can cause extremely realistic images that seem completely real for a few moments. But even knowing that possibility, the memory still feels unsettling. I remember the way the room looked, the shape of the figure, and the unnatural angle of his head. I remember blinking, expecting it to disappear, and seeing that it was still there. And I remember the feeling of pulling the blanket over my head and hoping that whatever I had seen would be gone by morning. Even now, years later, thinking about that night still gives me chills. When I think back to that period in my life, the memories come in pieces. Some parts feel incredibly clear, almost like photographs. Other parts feel distant and foggy, like something I'm remembering through thick glass. Grief has a strange way of doing that to a person. It doesn't just affect emotions. It changes how the mind stores and recalls experiences. Certain moments stay sharp and vivid, while others blur together, and sometimes you're not even sure if you're remembering them exactly the way they happened. At the center of that time in my life was something that changed everything in our family. My dad had taken his own life in our garage. Even now, years later, it feels strange to say those words out loud. At the time, my mind struggled to process what it meant. One day he was there, like always. I'm part of the everyday rhythm of our house. Then suddenly, he was gone. And the place we had lived in for years no longer felt the same. The house felt different almost immediately. It wasn't just emotional, it was physical, like the atmosphere had shifted. Every room seemed quieter than before. Even familiar objects like the kitchen table or the hallway mirror carried a weight they hadn't had before. When something tragic happens in a home, every corner starts to hold a memory. In the days right after it happened, our house was filled with a strange mix of people and emotions. Friends and relatives came by to check on us. Some brought food. Some just sat in the living room with us without saying much. Conversations happened in low voices. Sometimes people spoke gently. and sometimes they just sat in silence because there were no words that could really make anything better. Grief doesn't arrive in neat stages the way people sometimes describe it. It moves unpredictably. One moment you feel numb, almost disconnected from everything around you. Then suddenly something small, a smell, a sound, a memory hits you, and the reality of the loss comes crashing back. Those early days felt like we were all just trying to get through each hour. A couple of days after my dad died, I stepped outside at night. I don't remember exactly why I went outside. Maybe I needed air. Maybe the house felt too full of memories in that moment. Sometimes when a loss happens inside a home, the walls themselves start to feel heavy. Going outside is the only way to breathe again. The night was quiet. I stood in the yard for a while, just looking at the house. From the outside, it looked exactly the same as it always had. The lights in a few rooms were on, and the garage sat off to the side like it had every day before. But knowing what had happened inside made the place feel unfamiliar. The garage in particular had become difficult to look at. Just a few days earlier, it had been an ordinary part of the house. Now it carried a meaning none of us wanted. While I was standing there, something caught my attention. The garage door started to open. At first, I assumed someone inside the house had pressed the opener. The door lifted slowly, just like it always did. The motor made its usual humming sound as the panels rolled upward along the track. I looked toward the house, expecting to see someone walking toward the garage or stepping outside, but no one appeared. The door finished opening. A moment later, the light inside the garage turned on. Then it turned off, then on again, then off again. The light flickered several times in a row, almost like someone inside the garage was playing with the switch. It wasn't a single flicker like a loose bulb. It was deliberate, like someone was flipping the light back and forth. From where I was standing, I could see far enough inside to notice something important. The garage looked empty. I remember staring at it, trying to understand what I was seeing. At that point, my mind was already overwhelmed by everything that had happened in the previous days. Seeing something strange only made the moment more confusing. My first thought was that someone inside the house had opened the garage remotely. Some garage systems allow you to do that from inside. Maybe my mom had pressed the button and I just hadn't seen her come out. I looked back toward the house again. There was no one near the door, no one stepping outside, no movement at all. After a few moments, the garage door started to close again. The motor hummed as the door lowered back down into place. The light inside the garage went dark. Just like that, everything returned to normal. The yard was quiet again and the house looked still. Later that night, I mentioned what I had seen. My mom and my aunt had both been inside the house at the time. Neither of them had opened the garage door. At least, that's what they said when I brought it up. The conversation didn't last long. My aunt had very strong religious beliefs. She was the kind of person who saw spiritual meaning in many things. As soon as she heard what I described, she offered her own explanation. In her mind, what I saw wasn't mechanical or accidental. She believed that demons had been attracted to the house because of my dad's death. According to her, they were there to disturb us, to torment us while we were grieving. She believed the flickering lights and the opening garage door were signs of something supernatural. Hearing that explanation didn't help anything. If anything, it made the memory more uncomfortable. When someone introduces a supernatural idea during an already emotional time, it can make a simple mystery feel darker than it really is. I didn't want to believe that explanation. I still don't. But at the time, I also didn't have a clear answer for what I saw. Another detail that complicates the memory is that I had been drinking that night. Not heavily, but enough that it might have affected how clearly I remember certain details. Alcohol, combined with exhaustion and grief, can make memories less reliable. Because of that, I've always tried to be careful about how confidently I describe what happened. I remember seeing the garage door open. I remember the light turning on and off. I remember believing that no one was inside. But memory isn't a perfect recording device. It's more like a reconstruction our brains build later from scattered pieces. After that night, nothing else like it happened. I stayed in the house for about 2 more weeks before moving out. During that time, there were no other strange events. No lights flickering unexpectedly, no doors opening by themselves. One afternoon, I was actually alone in the house for several hours while cleaning. Now, if anything unusual had been happening, that would have been the time to notice it. But everything stayed completely normal. No strange noises, no unexplained movement, just silence and the quiet sound of cleaning and organizing. Because of that, I've often wondered if the garage incident had a simple explanation. Garage door openers sometimes malfunction. Electrical systems can cause lights to flicker or switch unexpectedly. Remote signals from nearby devices can occasionally trigger openers accidentally. Those explanations are far more likely than anything supernatural. But grief changes how we interpret events. When you're dealing with a loss that shocking, your brain searches for meaning everywhere. Every unusual moment feels important. I never brought the story up with my mom again. Part of that was because I didn't want to reopen painful memories for her. The days after my dad died were some of the hardest days of her life. Bringing up strange details from that time didn't feel fair. The only other person I told was a friend a couple of weeks later. Even then, I explained that my memory might not be completely reliable because of everything that was going on. Over time, the memory settled into a strange place in my mind. Not as something supernatural, not as something frightening, just as one of many moments from that period that felt surreal. Grief has a way of bending reality slightly. When your life is suddenly divided into before and after, the world can feel out of alignment for a while. Ordinary events can seem mysterious because your brain is struggling to process emotions that are too large to handle all at once. When I think about that night now, I don't see it as something paranormal. I see it as a moment when my mind was trying to navigate shock, exhaustion, and sadness while witnessing something that probably had a very simple mechanical explanation. But at the time, standing outside in the dark, watching the garage door open and the light flicker on and off, it felt like the house itself was reacting to everything that had happened. And in a strange way, that feeling reflects what grief really does. It changes how every place, every object, and every memory feels for a while. Eventually, life moves forward. The house becomes just a house again. The garage becomes just a garage. The sharp edges of the memories soften over time, but certain moments stay with you, not because they were supernatural, but because they happened during one of the most emotionally intense chapters of your life. That night outside the garage became one of those moments for me. The summer between my freshman and sophomore years of high school is one I still think about from time to time. A lot of summers blend together when you look back, but that one stands out clearly because of something strange that kept happening at a friend's house. Even now, years later, I still don't know who the people were or what they wanted. That summer, one of my close friends and his family had to move in temporarily with his grandmother. They had been in the process of buying a house, but after the purchase went through, the place needed more repairs than expected. The work was going to take several weeks, maybe longer, so his grandmother offered to let them stay with her until everything was finished. Her house was beautiful. It was large, much bigger than the houses most of us lived in at the time. It sat far back from the road, maybe 500 feet or so, and the property was surrounded by woods on every side. It felt private and quiet out there, almost like its own little world. When you drove down the long driveway toward the house, you couldn't see any other homes nearby. Inside, the house had this amazing living room that everyone loved. The ceiling was vaulted and high, making the space feel huge. The walls were mostly glass. Floor-to-ceiling windows surrounded the room on multiple sides, which meant you could see out into the woods no matter where you stood. During the day, it looked incredible because sunlight poured in from every direction. At night, though, it gave you a strange feeling. When the lights were on inside, you could see out into the darkness, but you also knew that anyone outside could see directly in. There were no nearby neighbors looking through those windows, so it usually didn't matter. The house was so far from the road that you rarely saw anyone walking near the property anyway. My friend's grandmother lived there with my friend's cousin. She was 2 years older than me and was about to start her senior year of high school. She mostly stayed in her own part of the house, but everyone got along well enough. With my friend and his family moving in temporarily, there were suddenly more people around the house, which made it feel even more lively. Not long after they moved in, I went over one Saturday to spend the night. At that age, staying at a friend's house meant video games, junk food, and staying up way too late. His bedroom was pretty small though, and we figured it would be more comfortable to sleep in the living room. There were 2 large couches in there, and with the huge windows and the tall ceiling, it felt like sleeping in some kind of cool glass cabin in the woods. We stayed up talking and joking around until about 1 in the morning. Eventually, we turned off the TV and started getting settled down to sleep. The lights were still on in the room as we were getting comfortable on the couches. That was when something caught our attention. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement outside one of the windows. At first, I thought it was a deer or some other animal moving through the yard. The property had plenty of wildlife, so that wouldn't have been unusual. But when I looked more carefully, I realized it wasn't an animal. It was a person. Actually, it looked like someone walking past the window just a few feet outside. Both of us saw it at the same time. We froze for a second, staring at the glass. Whoever it was had moved out of sight already, disappearing toward the side of the house. But there was no doubt about what we had seen. Someone had just walked past the window. We immediately started freaking out. This was the middle of the night. In a house far back from the road, surrounded by woods, there was no reason for anyone to be out there. We rushed down the hallway and woke up my friend's dad. He came into the living room and quickly shut off the lights, so the inside of the house went dark. That made it easier to see outside. For a moment, we didn't see anything. Then we noticed a faint red glow in the distance. About 100 feet away, right at the edge of the tree line, there were 2 small red lights flickering in the darkness. As our eyes adjusted, we realized what they were. 2 people were standing out there, passing a cigarette back and forth. They weren't moving. They weren't talking loudly. They were just standing there, facing the house, watching. That image is burned into my memory. 2 faint red dots appearing and disappearing as someone took a drag, then handed the cigarette to the other person. They were far enough away that we couldn't see their faces, but it was clear they were there. My friend's dad immediately called the police. After making the call, he opened the front door and yelled out into the yard. His voice carried across the open space toward the woods. As soon as he shouted, the 2 figures moved. They turned and ran back into the trees. Within seconds, they were gone. See, the police arrived not long afterward and searched the area around the house and the woods nearby. But the forest was full of narrow animal paths and little trails that twisted in every direction. If someone knew how to move quietly through those woods, they could disappear quickly. The officers didn't find anyone. We talked about it for a while that night, before finally going to sleep, though none of us slept particularly well. The whole thing felt strange. The house was isolated. There were only 3 other houses within about a mile, and none of them had teenagers living there. One house belonged to a family with very small children. The other 2 belonged to older couples with no kids at all. So where had those two people come from? A few weeks later, I went over there again with another friend. Well, the three of us planned to spend the night and watch movies like we usually did. It felt normal again by then. The strange night with the cigarette lights had almost started to feel like a weird, one-time event. Around 10 o'clock that night, we walked into the living room to pick out a movie, and there he was. A man was standing right outside the window, staring in. He was so close to the glass that when we turned on the light, we saw him immediately. For a split second, we just stared at each other through the window. Then we all shouted at the same time. The man turned and ran. By the time we reached the front door, he had already disappeared into the darkness. Once again, when we looked toward the tree line, we could see the faint glow of cigarettes in the distance. They were back. Over the course of that summer, these strange visits kept happening. We started calling them the Watchers, because that's exactly what they seemed to be doing, watching. Sometimes they stood in the trees. Sometimes they crept close to the house. Once or twice they knocked on the windows. Another time they shook the front door so violently that it set off the burglar alarm, which scared them off long enough for us to regain our breath. There were 3 spots around the property where they seemed to appear most often. One was the tree line about 100 feet away. Another was near the side of the house where the windows faced the woods. The third was closer to the driveway. But the strange part was that there was no pattern. Sometimes weeks would pass without seeing them. Then suddenly they would appear again late at night, standing silently in the darkness. One night someone even wrote the word "hello" on the outside of the living room window using lipstick. Seeing that message smeared across the glass in the morning gave everyone a chill. During the daytime, we searched the woods more than once, hoping to find some clue about where these people were coming from. We followed game trails, checked behind fallen trees, and looked for any sign of a campsite or hiding spot. We never found anything. Our best guess was that they were probably guys from our school. My friend's cousin was attractive, and she sometimes lounged by the pool in a swimsuit during the day. The theory was that maybe someone had discovered the house and decided to sneak into the woods, hoping to catch a glimpse of her through the windows. But even that explanation didn't fully make sense. Either the effort it would take to sneak through the woods repeatedly, just for a chance of seeing someone inside the house, seemed extreme. And we never recognized any faces clearly enough to confirm who they were. Eventually, the house my friend's family had purchased was finally repaired. The construction finished, and they moved out of the grandmother's place and into their new home. After they left, the visits stopped. Who the Watchers were, why they kept returning, and how they always managed to disappear into those woods without a trace remains one of the strangest mysteries I've ever experienced. Even now, years later, I sometimes think about those red cigarette lights glowing quietly in the tree line and the feeling of being watched through those massive windows in the middle of the night. About 5 years ago, my dad and I were having one of those quiet evenings at home that felt completely ordinary. It was the kind of night where nothing unusual was expected to happen. It must have been around 8 or 9 in the evening, and we were sitting together in the living room watching an episode of Stargate SG-1. That show was something we both liked, so whenever it was on, we would usually end up sitting down to watch it together. It had become a comfortable little routine for us. The house was calm that night. The television cast a soft glow across the room, and outside the windows it was already dark. There were no strange sounds, no interruptions, nothing that hinted the evening would turn into something memorable. It felt like any other normal night at home. Our house itself is fairly old and has some local history connected to it. It's actually listed as a historical home in the area, which means people sometimes show curiosity about it. Occasionally, someone might slow down while walking past and look at the architecture or ask questions about how long the house has been standing there. Still, that kind of curiosity almost always happens during the daytime. It's very unusual for anyone to approach the house late in the evening. Right in the middle of the episode we were watching, we suddenly heard a loud knocking on the front door. It wasn't a gentle tap or a hesitant knock. It was firm and clear, the kind of knocking that instantly grabs your attention. The sound echoed through the hallway and into the living room, making it impossible to ignore. My dad and I both looked up at the same moment. The television was still playing, but the knock had broken the calm of the evening. Whoever was at the door clearly wanted to be heard. My dad reached for the remote and muted the television, and for a moment we both just sat there listening, waiting to see if it would happen again. Another knock followed. What made it strange right away was which door the person had chosen. Almost everyone who comes to our house uses the side door. Friends, neighbors, family members, delivery drivers, everyone naturally goes there. The side door leads directly to the kitchen area, and over the years, it has just become the standard entrance. The front door exists, of course, but it's rarely used unless someone is unfamiliar with the house. So hearing someone knock loudly on the front door late at night immediately felt a little unusual. My dad and I exchanged puzzled looks before standing up and walking toward the hallway together. We weren't scared exactly, but we were definitely curious. It wasn't every night that someone showed up at that door. When my dad opened it, we were both surprised by who we saw standing there. On the porch stood a very frail-looking elderly woman. She looked extremely thin and delicate. Her posture was slightly bent forward and her movements were slow and careful. She looked like the type of person you might instinctively worry about if you saw them walking alone. For a brief moment, my dad and I glanced at each other without saying anything. Two thoughts crossed both of our minds at almost the exact same time. The first was about the knocking. The sound we had heard had been loud and strong. It had carried through the house clearly, yet the woman standing in front of us looked so fragile that it seemed difficult to imagine her producing that kind of knock. The second thought had to do with where our house sits. Our home is built on a hill. To reach the front porch, someone has to walk up a pathway and climb several steps, leading to the front entrance. It's not an impossible climb by any means, but it's enough that you notice it, especially if someone isn't very steady on their feet. Looking at the woman, it seemed surprising that she had made that climb alone at night. Still, there she was. When we turned our full attention back to her, she appeared calm and composed. She didn't seem lost or distressed. Instead, she began asking questions about the house. She asked how old the house was. She wondered whether we had lived there long. She also asked if we knew anything about the history of the building. Because the house is historically listed, questions like that weren't completely out of place. Sometimes people interested in local architecture or neighborhood history will stop by to ask about it. It's rare, but it does happen. Usually, though, those conversations happen during the day. Despite the odd timing, we stood there and talked with her. The conversation itself felt normal enough. She was polite and seemed genuinely curious about the property. She asked about renovations and whether any original parts of the house were still intact. My dad answered most of her questions, explaining what he knew about the history and mentioning some changes that had been made over the years. I mostly stood nearby listening. Looking back, the entire conversation probably lasted around 10 or 15 minutes. It wasn't especially long, but it was long enough that the situation felt relaxed. She didn't behave in a threatening or strange way. Aside from the unusual circumstances of her arrival, she seemed like a perfectly normal elderly woman with an interest in the house. Eventually, the conversation reached a natural stopping point. She thanked us for taking the time to talk with her. My dad said goodbye, and then he gently closed the door. Once the door was shut, The quiet of the house returned almost immediately. My dad and I turned toward each other and started talking about how unusual the visit had been. It wasn't fear we were feeling. It was more curiosity and mild confusion. We talked for just a few seconds. Then my dad suddenly said something. He mentioned that he hoped she would make it down the steps safely because she looked so fragile. The thought made sense. The pathway leading away from our porch goes down the hill toward the street, and even though it's not terribly steep, it could still be tricky for someone who wasn't very steady. The porch light was on, and the walkway was clearly visible from the window near the door. If she was still making her way down, we should have been able to see her easily. So we walked over and looked outside. The porch light illuminated the front steps and the pathway leading away from the house. The yard was clearly visible, and the walkway stretched down toward the street, but there was no one there. The space was completely empty. No elderly woman on the steps. No figure walking down the path. No one standing near the gate at the bottom of the hill. At first, we assumed she must have already reached the bottom of the walkway and turned onto the street. But the strange part was the timing. We had only been talking for a few seconds after closing the door. Given how slowly and carefully she appeared to move, it didn't seem possible that she could have reached the bottom of the hill and disappeared completely out of sight in that short amount of time. The entire path from the porch to the street was visible from the window, yet there was no sign of her anywhere. We stood there quietly for a moment, staring out into the night as if she might suddenly appear from somewhere we hadn't noticed. My dad eventually opened the door again and stepped onto the porch to look around. The yard was quiet. The street was empty. There was no one there. It was as if she had simply vanished in the few seconds that we weren't watching. To this day, neither of us has been able to explain it. Maybe she moved faster than we expected. Maybe she stepped off the path somewhere we couldn't see. Maybe the darkness hid her in a way that made her blend into the surroundings. But both my dad and I remember that moment clearly. We remember hearing the loud knocking. We remember opening the door and seeing the frail, elderly woman standing there. We remember talking with her about the house for several minutes. And we both remember walking to the window just seconds later and finding the path completely empty. It wasn't exactly terrifying, but it left a strange feeling behind. Even now, years later, whenever my dad and I talk about it, we both remember the same details. And we still wonder how someone who looked so fragile could disappear so quickly down a brightly lit path. Some experiences stay with you not because they were frightening, but because they never quite made sense. When people talk about frightening experiences, many stories involve ghosts or something supernatural. Mine is nothing like that. What happened to me was completely real, and that's exactly what makes it so unsettling when I think back on it now. It was one of those moments where a small decision could have ended very badly. At the time, I was just a child and didn't fully understand how dangerous the situation really was. I'm Korean, but I live in Canada now. When I was younger, I spent about half of my elementary school years living in South Korea. My family moved back and forth for a while because of work and other reasons. Some of my earliest school memories are from Korea, and like many kids there, I had to figure out how to get around the city pretty early. In the mornings, things were simple. A school bus would pick me up and take me to school. That part of the routine felt safe and organized. There were other kids on the bus, and adults were responsible for making sure we arrived at school properly. Going home in the afternoon was different. Once school ended, we were expected to find our own way home. Some kids lived close enough to walk. Others were picked up by parents or relatives. In my case, I had to use public transit. That meant taking the subway, which is very common in Seoul. The subway system there is huge and extremely busy. Even adults sometimes feel overwhelmed navigating it, but for kids growing up there, it becomes normal pretty quickly. I was still very young when this happened. I was in grade 1, around 8 or 9 years old. Looking back now, that feels incredibly young to be traveling alone on such a busy transit system, but at the time it didn't seem unusual. Many kids did it. One important detail about the subway stations back then is that they did not yet have the platform screen doors that exist today. If you visit many subway stations in South Korea now, you'll see glass barriers that separate passengers from the tracks. These doors open only when the train arrives, which helps prevent accidents and suicides. But at the time of my story, those barriers didn't exist yet. The platform was completely open. That meant the tracks were fully exposed right in front of everyone waiting for the train. One afternoon after school, I was standing on the platform waiting for my train home. It was just another normal day. People were standing in small groups, some looking at their phones, others talking quietly or watching the tracks for the approaching train. I had my transit card hanging around my neck. In Korea, especially for kids, transit cards often come attached to a lanyard so they don't get lost easily. Mine was a child transit card shaped like a little blue t-shirt. It was simple and a bit playful looking, designed for kids to carry around easily. As I stood there waiting, I started playing with the card. Kids get bored easily, and when you're waiting on a platform with nothing to do, it's easy to start fidgeting. I was twirling the card around on the lanyard, spinning it between my fingers, letting it swing and spin like a toy. For a while, nothing happened. Then suddenly, my fingers slipped. The card flew out of my hand. I watched it fall in what felt like slow motion. It dropped off the platform edge and landed directly on the rail below. My heart immediately started racing. Even as a kid, I knew that losing the card would be a big problem. Without it, I wouldn't be able to get through the exit gates at my station. I also worried that the train might run over it and destroy it before I could get it back. I stood there frozen for a moment, staring down at the card sitting on the track. People around me didn't seem to notice. Everyone was focused on their own routines. I hesitated. Part of me knew that climbing down onto the tracks was dangerous, but another part of me was just thinking about getting my card back before the train arrived. After a few seconds of thinking, I made a decision that still scares me when I remember it. I jumped down onto the tracks. At that moment, retrieving the card felt like the most important thing in the world. I quickly grabbed it from the rail and looked up at the platform. Climbing back up from where I had jumped down wasn't easy. The platform wall was higher than I expected. I realized that the nearest way back up was at the end of the platform where there were stairs leading up. So I started moving in that direction as fast as I could. But the tracks stretch a long distance, and even running, I could tell I wasn't going to reach the stairs quickly enough. Then I heard something that made my stomach drop. The train arrival bell started ringing. Anyone who has used the subway knows that sound. It's the warning that the train is approaching the station. Hearing it while standing safely on the platform is normal. Hearing it while standing on the tracks is terrifying. The panic hit me instantly. I knew I wouldn't reach the stairs in time. The train was already approaching the station, and I had no chance of climbing out before it arrived. My mind raced, trying to think of something, anything that could keep me safe. Then I noticed the space underneath the platform. Many subway platforms have a small recessed area beneath the edge, designed partly for safety and maintenance. It's not large, but it can create a small gap between the platform structure and the train. I quickly moved toward that space and squeezed myself underneath. Even as a child, I knew this was a desperate move. I pressed my body as close to the wall as possible. My back was against a metal vent, and I pushed myself flat, trying to make my body as small as possible. The air down there was awful. It smelled like oil, metal, and dust. I remember breathing, feeling difficult and unpleasant, but I didn't dare move. Then the train arrived. The sound was overwhelming. The rumbling of the train entering the station felt like thunder shaking the ground around me. The wheels screeched against the rails and the entire structure vibrated. I was terrified that something under the train might hit me. I kept imagining that a piece of metal would scrape against me or that the train compartments would extend farther than I expected. But the train stopped. It hadn't hit me. I stayed completely still while the passengers got on and off above me. I could hear footsteps and voices through the platform floor. All the while, I kept thinking about how easily things could have gone wrong. Eventually, the train doors closed and the train pulled away. When the noise finally faded, I felt my body start to relax. The fear that had frozen me began to fade, replaced by exhaustion and shock. I crawled out from under the platform and tried to climb back up, but before I could get very far, a subway security worker spotted me. His reaction was immediate. He rushed toward me and quickly pulled me up from the tracks. I remember coughing and gagging from the smell and the dust. My hands were shaking and I could barely speak. He looked shocked, probably wondering how a child had ended up down there. I don't remember everything that happened afterward, but I do remember feeling embarrassed and scared at the same time. I had realized by then how dangerous what I did had been. When I think about it today, the memory feels much heavier than it did back then. As a child, I mostly focused on the immediate fear of the train arriving. As an adult, I understand how close I might have come to something much worse. One small mistake, one dropped transit card, one impulsive decision. That's all it took for me to end up lying under a subway platform while a train rolled in above me. Whenever I see the platform screen doors that now exist in Korean subway stations, I think about that moment. Those barriers are there to stop exactly the kind of situation I found myself in. At the time, it just felt like a scary accident. Now it feels like a narrow escape. Pardon the interruption for just a moment. I hope these stories are keeping you on the edge of your seat tonight. If you're finding yourself drawn to these dark accounts, I'd love to have you join us. If you're new here, please consider hitting that subscribe button. We share new true horror stories every single day, and being part of the community is the only way to make sure you never miss a nightmare. A quick like and a comment also means a lot. It really helps the shadows spread a little further. But for now, let's get back to it. The darkness is calling. In 2011, I reached a point where I had to admit something to myself that I had been avoiding for a long time. My drinking had gotten completely out of control. It wasn't just casual drinking anymore or something I could brush off as stress relief. Alcohol had become the center of my life in a way that scared me. I was starting to realize that if I didn't change something soon, things were going to get much worse. So I made a decision to try Alcoholics Anonymous. At first, the idea made me uncomfortable. I had always imagined AA meetings as something very serious and intimidating. But when I finally walked into the local AA club, I realized it was different from what I expected. It wasn't just a meeting space, it was more like a gathering place for people trying to stay sober. One of the first things I noticed was that the doors were almost never locked. You could come and go at any time of day or night. People who were struggling would sometimes just show up and sit quietly. Some people attended meetings, others just hung around the building drinking coffee, smoking cigarettes, and trying to stay away from alcohol for one more night. At that time, smoking indoors was still allowed in that building. The place always had a faint haze of cigarette smoke and the smell of coffee. It wasn't glamorous by any means, but it had a strange sense of comfort to it. Everyone there was fighting their own battle with addiction. I quickly developed a habit of spending late nights there. Sometimes I would stay until 2 in the morning, just sitting in a chair, now drinking coffee and trying to keep my mind busy so I wouldn't go out and buy alcohol. It became a kind of safe zone for me. As long as I stayed there, I knew I probably wouldn't drink. After a while, I started noticing the same people showing up regularly. Some of them were friendly and supportive. Others kept to themselves. But there was one guy who stood out immediately. He was always there. No matter what time I showed up, there was a good chance he was already sitting somewhere in the room or outside smoking. He spent an incredible amount of time at the club, more than anyone else I had seen. It didn't take long to notice that something about him made other people uncomfortable. He had a reputation among the regulars. Some people openly avoided him. Others would get irritated when he started talking. A few seemed genuinely afraid of him. Conversations would go quiet when he walked into the room. It was obvious that he had serious issues beyond alcohol. Still, I tried to keep an open mind. At that point in my life, my own self-image was extremely low. I had convinced myself that I was probably the most messed up person in the room. Meeting someone who seemed even more unstable made me think about what my future might look like if I kept going down the same path. So I decided to treat him with patience. Whenever he approached me, I let him talk. And he talked a lot. He could ramble for hours about whatever was on his mind. Sometimes it didn't even make sense, but I figured that he was probably very lonely, and maybe just having someone listen would help him a little. There was also a strange logic in my mind at the time, that I thought that if I treated people kindly, even difficult people, maybe that kindness would somehow come back to me later. I wanted to believe that being patient with him might create some kind of good karma in my life. Behind the AA building, there was a small outdoor area with a fire pit. People would often gather there at night. Sometimes someone would bring a bundle of firewood to donate. On colder evenings, we would sit around the fire, smoke cigarettes, and talk. Occasionally, someone would even cook something simple over the flames. One night, I was sitting outside with that same guy. The fire was burning low, mostly glowing coals. He had a long stick in his hands and was poking at the fire absent-mindedly. As he stirred the coals, the end of the stick began to glow red from the heat. While he did this, he was complaining. He spent a lot of time talking about how people treated him. According to him, everyone in the AA club judged him unfairly. They avoided him, talked about him behind his back, and treated him like he was dangerous. I had known him for a couple of months by that point, and I thought maybe I could help him understand why people reacted to him the way they did. So I decided to say something honest. I told him that the reason people seemed scared of him was because sometimes he did things that came across as frightening or aggressive. I tried to say it carefully, without attacking him personally. I explained that people can only judge someone by their actions. If your behavior makes people uncomfortable, they will naturally keep their distance. He didn't take that well. His entire posture changed. The relaxed, rambling tone he had been using disappeared. He became defensive almost immediately. He started arguing that everyone else was just being judgmental. According to him, if he changed the way he acted, it would mean that they were right about him and he was wrong. In his mind, that was unacceptable. The conversation quickly turned tense. I tried to stay calm and explain my point again. I said that other people can't see inside your thoughts. The only information they have about you comes from watching how you behave. That was when he got really angry. He pulled the stick out of the fire. The tip was glowing bright orange from the heat. He stood up and began waving it slowly near my face. The heat radiating from it was intense. I could feel it even though he wasn't touching me. For context, I'm a fairly tall guy. I'm about 6 feet 2 inches. But I've always been extremely thin, and for most of my life, I've struggled with a crushing sense of insecurity. Deep down, I've always believed that almost every other guy I meet is physically stronger than I am. That belief creates a constant background fear in my mind. I'm always aware that if someone really wanted to hurt me, I probably wouldn't be able to stop them. So when he started waving that burning stick next to my head, that fear exploded all at once. Then he said something that made the situation even worse. He looked straight at me and said that he could shove the stick through my eye socket and kill me right there. He pointed out that no one else was around. According to him, if he did it, I would be dead before anyone knew what happened. He even said he might get away with it. My entire body started shaking. I was genuinely terrified. I didn't try to argue with him. I didn't try to challenge him. Instead, I asked the only question that came into my mind at that moment. I asked him what I could do to convince him not to hurt me. He stared at me for a moment and then gave me an answer. He said I needed to stop talking badly about him. In his mind, my earlier attempt at advice had been an insult, so I did the only thing I could think of to stay safe. I stopped arguing. I stopped challenging anything he said. I just listened. For the next 2 hours, I sat there while he complained about everyone in his life. He talked about how unfair people were, how misunderstood he was, and how the world treated him badly. I nodded along and said as little as possible. Eventually, another regular from the AA club arrived at the fire pit. The moment I saw him, I felt an enormous sense of relief. I quietly explained what had happened and asked if he could give me a ride home. He agreed immediately. On the drive, I told him the full story. He was shocked and angry on my behalf. He suggested that I should call the police and report what had happened, but I didn't. At the time, I was still trying to focus on staying sober. I didn't want to create more chaos in my life. I just wanted distance from that situation. Looking back now, the whole experience feels surreal. That AA club was supposed to be a safe place for people trying to rebuild their lives. For the most part, it was. But that night reminded me that sometimes people carry deeper problems that sobriety alone can't fix. And sometimes the most important thing you can do in a dangerous moment is stay calm, listen, and wait for the chance to leave safely. Several years ago, my wife's family owned a few small cabins along the Delaware River. It was the kind of place families passed down over time, where relatives would come and go during different weekends or holidays. The cabins sat along a long dirt road that followed the river, and the whole area had a quiet, isolated feeling. Tall trees surrounded the road, and once the sun started going down, the woods became very dark very quickly. That weekend, my wife and I were visiting the cabins with her cousin and his wife. They were about the same age as us, so the four of us usually got along well and spent time together whenever we visited. The plan was simple. Relax, cook some food, maybe sit outside near the river and enjoy the quiet. The afternoon had started normally enough, but sometime later her cousin and his wife got into an argument. I don't even remember what it was about now. It wasn't anything violent, just one of those heated arguments couples sometimes have when they've been around each other all day. Voices got louder, emotions ran high, and eventually he decided to go for a walk to cool down. That didn't seem like a big deal at first. The dirt road that ran past the cabins was long and quiet, and people often walked along it. It stretched for about a mile before reaching a nature preserve at the end. Beyond that point were hiking trails that wound deeper into the forest. It was a peaceful place during the day, and taking a walk there was pretty normal, so when he left, nobody thought too much of it. We figured he'd take a short walk, clear his head, and come back once he'd calmed down. Back at the cabin, the rest of us stayed inside talking and trying to lighten the mood. But after a while, we started noticing how much time had passed. An hour went by, then another. The sun had started dropping lower in the sky. My wife and her cousin's wife began to worry. They kept glancing out the window and checking the road, expecting to see him coming back around the bend at any moment. But the road remained empty. Eventually, they asked if I would go look for him. It made sense. I was the only one who hadn't been part of the argument, and they thought maybe he'd be more willing to come back if someone neutral went to find him. Plus, they didn't want to wander around looking for him themselves, as it was getting closer to evening. So I agreed. I stepped outside and started walking down the dirt road. The road ran straight through the trees with the cabins scattered along one side. As I walked, the sounds of the river and the wind through the leaves were the only things I could hear. It was quiet enough that even small noises seemed amplified. I called out his name a few times as I walked. No answer. I kept going, checking around the sides of the road, expecting maybe he had wandered off somewhere nearby, but there was no sign of him anywhere. Eventually, I reached the end of the road. That's where the nature preserve started. A wooden sign marked the entrance, and a narrow trail disappeared into the trees. I stepped a few feet onto the trail and called his name again. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, somewhere deeper in the woods, I heard a voice. It simply said, "Here." The voice was faint, but clear enough that I assumed it was him. Relieved, I stepped a little farther onto the trail and called out again. I told him everyone was worried and that he should come back to the cabin before it got dark. Again, the voice answered, "Here." It sounded like it was coming from somewhere farther down the trail. At first, I was slightly annoyed. I figured he was deliberately staying out of sight because he was still upset from the argument. Maybe he just wanted to make me walk out to him. So I started walking down the trail toward where I thought the voice was coming from. The path curved through the trees, and the deeper I went, the darker it felt. The sun was already low, and the forest canopy blocked most of the remaining light. Every so often I would stop and call his name again. Each time the same voice answered, "Well, here." And each time it seemed a little closer. At that point I started feeling a bit uneasy. Something about the way the voice responded felt strange. It wasn't conversational. It didn't answer any of the things I was saying. It just repeated that single word. Still, I kept walking for a little while longer. The trail continued deeper into the woods, and the light was fading quickly. I could feel the temperature dropping slightly as evening approached. Finally, I stopped and called out one more time. I told him we should head back to the cabin because it was getting dark. That's when the voice answered again. But this time it said something different. "You come here." Hearing that stopped me cold. The tone felt wrong. It wasn't playful or irritated like someone who had been arguing earlier. It sounded distant and flat. More importantly, it didn't really sound like him. By that point, the woods were already getting dark, and the trail ahead disappeared into shadow. A sudden feeling of unease crept over me. The deeper I looked into the trees, the more I realized I couldn't actually see anyone. I had been walking toward a voice I couldn't see, down a trail that was getting darker by the minute, and the voice was asking me to go even farther in. That's when I decided to turn around. I called out once more that I was heading back to the cabin and that he could come back whenever he wanted. Then I started walking back the way I came. As I left the trail and returned to the dirt road, the last of the daylight was fading. The trees along the road seemed darker than before, and I found myself walking faster than I had on the way out. When the cabin finally came into view, I felt a wave of relief. But the moment I stepped inside, something even stranger happened. Her cousin was sitting there, right there in the cabin. He had already come back. My wife and his wife both looked up when I walked in, and they immediately noticed the expression on my face. Apparently, I looked completely stunned. I asked him when he got back. He said he had returned not long before I did. I told them what had just happened in the woods. How I had gone down the road looking for him. How I heard someone answering me from inside the preserve. how the voice kept saying "here" and slowly seemed to get closer as I walked toward it. And how the last thing it said was, "You come here." The room went quiet. We all just sat there for a moment thinking about it. If he had already returned to the cabin, then who had been answering me in the woods? To this day, none of us know. Maybe it was another hiker on the trail who thought it was funny to mess with someone calling out. Maybe the voice carried strangely through the trees and it wasn't coming from where I thought it was. But the thing that still bothers me is the way the voice kept trying to pull me deeper into the woods, and how it told me to come closer when it was almost dark. Sometimes I still think about what might have happened if I had kept following that voice down the trail. This isn't my story personally, and in a way that probably takes a little bit away from the fear of it. When something happens directly to you, the emotions and memories are usually stronger. But even though this didn't happen to me, it's one of those stories that has stayed in my mind for years. The reason it stuck with me isn't just because of what happened, but because of the person who told it to me. The friend who shared this story with me is someone I've known for a long time. He's not the kind of person who tells wild stories just to get attention. He's pretty calm and straightforward. Most of the time, he talks about everyday things and doesn't exaggerate much. Because of that, when he told me this, he didn't present it like some dramatic ghost story meant to scare people. He told it very simply, almost casually. That calm way of telling it somehow made it feel more unsettling. According to him, the whole thing happened when he was about 8 years old. He was still living with his parents at the time in a regular family house in a quiet neighborhood. It was one of those places where kids played outside during the day, and the streets got very quiet once the sun went down. One evening, a friend of his had come over to visit. For kids that age, having a friend over meant the night would usually turn into games, laughter, and running around the house until someone eventually got tired or a parent told them to settle down. That night was no different in the beginning. The two of them had a lot of energy, and after a while they decided to play hide and seek. It's the kind of game almost every kid has played at some point. It's simple and fun. And when the house lights are low or the outside yard is dark, it can feel exciting and slightly spooky in a playful way. By the time they started the game, it was already getting pretty late. My friend said it must have been around 10 o'clock at night. For adults, that might not seem very late, but for kids, it definitely feels like nighttime has fully settled in. The outside world becomes quiet, and even familiar places can feel a little mysterious. They agreed on who would count first, and my friend ended up being the seeker. While he stood facing the wall and counted, his friend ran off somewhere to hide. When the counting finished, he turned around and started the search. At first, he checked the obvious places. Kids tend to use the same hiding spots again and again. He looked behind doors, inside closets, under tables, and in corners where someone small could easily squeeze. But his friend wasn't in any of those places. He walked through the living room, then the hallway, and into the kitchen. He opened a couple of doors and peeked inside other rooms. Still nothing. The house wasn't very big, so after a few minutes he started feeling confused. There were only so many places someone could hide. Even a clever hiding spot should have been found by then. Eventually, he started thinking that maybe his friend had gone outside. Kids sometimes take games like hide and seek to the next level by hiding in the yard or behind something outside. It wasn't completely unusual, so he walked over to the door and stepped outside. The yard was almost completely dark. There weren't many outdoor lights, and the street nearby was quiet. The trees and bushes surrounded parts of the yard, creating patches of thick shadow. When you're a kid, darkness can feel deeper than it really is. Shapes look different, and your imagination fills in the spaces you can't clearly see. He walked slowly across the yard, checking behind bushes and along the fence line. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then he heard something. From somewhere to his left, maybe 20 feet away, a voice called out. It sounded exactly like his friend. The voice came from a darker corner of the yard where the shadows were thickest. It called his name and told him to come over. At first, that seemed normal. In a game of hide and seek, it wouldn't be strange for someone to tease the seeker or try to trick them into looking in the wrong place. But something about the situation made him pause. He was already a little nervous about being outside in the dark alone. The bushes and trees created spots where someone could hide easily, and he couldn't clearly see who was standing there. Instead of walking over, he yelled back. He told his friend to come over to him instead. For a moment, there was silence again. Then the voice responded. It still sounded exactly like his friend. The tone was familiar, the voice recognizable. It repeated the request and told him to come closer. My friend refused again. He shouted back that his friend should come to him instead. The exchange went back and forth like that for a short time. Every time my friend said no, the voice kept insisting that he come over into the darker part of the yard. As this continued, he started feeling more uncomfortable. There was something strange about it. The voice sounded right, but the situation didn't feel right. If it really was his friend, why wouldn't he just step out from the shadows? Why stay hidden and keep calling him over? The longer it went on, the more tension he felt building. Then something happened that changed everything instantly. The voice changed. The friendly tone that sounded like his friend disappeared. In its place was a completely different voice. It was deeper, rougher, and much harsher. It sounded angry, almost demanding. The new voice ordered him to come over. The moment he heard that change, fear hit him immediately. He didn't stop to think about it any longer. His instincts took over. He turned around and ran straight back toward the house as fast as he could. He rushed through the door and slammed it behind him, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, he just stood there catching his breath. Then he walked into the living room. And that's when things became even stranger. His friend was sitting there, just sitting calmly inside the house like nothing had happened. My friend stared at him in confusion and asked how he had gotten back inside so quickly. From his perspective, he had just heard his friend calling to him from outside only seconds earlier. There should have been no way for him to run past him, get inside the house, and sit down without being seen. But his friend looked just as confused. He said he had never gone outside at all. According to him, he had been hiding inside the house the entire time. They went back and forth for a moment, each trying to understand what the other was saying. But neither of them could explain it. When my friend told me this story years later, he described the moment outside very clearly. The darkness in the yard, the thick bushes, the voice coming from somewhere he couldn't see. But the part he remembered most strongly was the feeling he had standing there. The voice sounded familiar enough to almost trust. It sounded just like someone he knew well. But at the same time, something deep inside him was telling him not to walk toward it. That instinct was strong enough to stop him. And even now, when I think about that story, that's the part that gives me the strangest feeling. Because hearing a voice in the dark is one thing, but hearing a voice that knows exactly how to sound, like someone you trust, is something else entirely. This happened a long time ago, back when we were all still very young. When I look back on it now, I realize just how small we actually were at the time. But when you are a kid, everything feels bigger and more serious than it probably really is. Childhood memories can stay with you in a strange way. Some fade over time, but others remain so clear that you can almost step right back into them. The strange or frightening memories especially seem to stick. Even now, after so many years have passed, I can still picture that moment in my mind almost perfectly, like a scene frozen in time. The house where this happened belonged to my family. It was a normal house in many ways, but like a lot of older homes, it had a basement. Basements always seem to have a different feeling than the rest of the house. Even when there is nothing wrong with them, they tend to feel darker and quieter. The lighting is usually dimmer, the air cooler, and there are often corners where shadows gather. For adults, it might not seem like a big deal, but when you are a child, a basement can feel like a completely separate world from the rest of the house. Our basement had that exact kind of atmosphere. The lights were not very bright, and some parts of the walls were unfinished. The ceiling had pipes running across it, and there were random boxes, tools, and old pieces of furniture stored along the sides. It was the kind of place where adults would keep things they did not use very often. To a kid's imagination, all those shapes and shadows could easily turn into something mysterious. Despite the slightly creepy atmosphere, we still played down there all the time. Kids usually do not think too deeply about things like that when they are busy having fun. The basement had a large open area where we could run around or make up games, and it became a regular place for us to hang out. This particular memory happened about 7 years before I first told the story to anyone outside of my family. At the time, my cousin and I were around 7 or 8 years old. My younger sister was even smaller, probably 5 or 6. At that age, everything feels like an adventure. You do not think about danger or strange possibilities. You just play. That day, the 3 of us were downstairs together in the basement. I honestly cannot remember exactly what game we were playing. When you are a kid, games change every few minutes anyway. One moment you might be pretending to be explorers searching for treasure, and the next, you might be building forts out of random objects or making up some imaginary story where one person is the hero and the others are side characters. Whatever it was we were doing, we were completely absorbed in it. We were laughing and moving around the room, using whatever we could find nearby to turn into part of the game. Time passes differently when you are a child. You can play for hours and it feels like only a short while. Connected to the basement was a small laundry room. It was not very large, just big enough for the washing machine and dryer. There were shelves along one wall where my family kept different household items like detergent, cleaning supplies, and other random things. And some of the shelves held older items that had probably been there for years. One of those items was a China doll. It sat on one of the higher shelves near the back of the room. I had seen it plenty of times before, and I never thought much about it. It was just one of those objects that had always been around. But if I am being honest, those porcelain dolls always have a slightly eerie look to them. The glassy eyes and perfectly still expressions can feel a little unsettling, especially in dim lighting. At the time, though, it was just another thing in the basement. The laundry room door was closed while we were playing. That door usually stayed shut unless someone was actually doing laundry. It helped keep the noise from the machines contained when they were running. We had been playing for quite a while when something changed. My sister suddenly stopped moving. The change was so sudden that my cousin and I noticed immediately. 1 second she had been playing with us like normal, and the next she was completely still. She was standing there without saying anything. At first we thought maybe she was just thinking about the game or deciding what to do next. But when we looked at her face, we both felt a strange uneasiness right away. She looked terrified. Not the kind of pretend fear kids show when they are joking around. This looked real. Her eyes were wide and her expression had completely changed. She was staring directly at the closed laundry room door. Slowly she raised her hand and pointed toward it. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. "Do you hear her?" My cousin and I looked at each other immediately. Neither of us had heard anything. The basement was quiet except for the usual background sounds of the house above us. I remember opening my mouth to answer her. I was about to say that we did not hear anything at all. I was probably going to tell her that maybe she was imagining something or that there was nothing to worry about. But before I could say a single word, something happened. The doorknob on the laundry room door moved. At first, it was just a slight movement, almost like a twitch. It might have been small, but it was enough to catch our attention instantly. All three of us froze. Then the knob slowly turned. None of us were anywhere near the door. We were sitting several feet away in the middle of the basement. There was no way any of us had touched it. The door began to open. It did not swing open suddenly. Instead, it creaked open slowly, inch by inch, as if someone on the other side was carefully pulling it. The moment felt incredibly long. None of us moved. None of us spoke. When something strange happens and you are a kid, sometimes your body just locks up. That is exactly what happened to us. We were all staring at the door as it slowly opened wider. My sister was still pointing at it. She leaned slightly toward us and whispered again, even quieter than before. "Can you hear her now?" That sentence made the moment even worse, because we still could not hear anything. There were no footsteps, no voices, no movement from inside the laundry room. Just silence. Then suddenly from inside the room, we heard the loudest crash I have ever heard. It sounded like something heavy had fallen and smashed onto the floor. The sound echoed through the entire basement. It was sharp and sudden, the kind of noise that makes your heart jump instantly. In that moment, whatever bravery we might have had disappeared. All three of us reacted exactly the same way. We ran. There was no discussion. No one suggested checking what had happened. We just ran for the basement stairs as fast as we possibly could. I cannot even remember who reached the stairs first. We were all scrambling at the same time, trying to get as far away from that laundry room as possible. When we reached the top of the stairs and got back into the main part of the house, we refused to go back down. Eventually, one of the adults in the house went downstairs to see what had caused the noise. At that point, we were still too scared to follow them, so we stayed upstairs and waited nervously to hear what they would say. After a few minutes, they came back up and told us what had happened. Something had fallen in the laundry room. Specifically, the china doll that had been sitting on the shelf had somehow fallen off. That explained the loud crash we heard, but there was one detail that made the whole situation feel strange. The doll was completely fine. No cracks, no chips, nothing broken at all. Porcelain dolls are fragile. If something like that falls from a shelf onto a hard floor, you would expect at least some damage. But according to the adult who picked it up, the doll looked perfectly normal, like nothing had happened to it at all. Even now, years later, that memory still gives me a strange feeling when I think about it. Maybe the shelf shifted slightly and caused the doll to fall. Maybe the door had not been fully closed and it moved because of air pressure somewhere in the house. Old houses can make strange noises and movements sometimes. There are probably perfectly normal explanations for most of what happened that day. But what I still cannot fully explain is the timing. My sister suddenly asked if we could hear something. Then the door opened. Then the crash happened. And the thing that still stands out the most in my memory is the look on her face before any of it started. That expression of fear came before the door moved, before the sound, before anything else happened. Even after all these years, that moment in the basement still feels just as strange as it did back then. Many years have passed since that winter morning, but the memory has never faded. Some moments in life become blurry with time, like old photographs that slowly lose their color, but others remain sharp and vivid no matter how many years go by. This experience is one of those memories for me. Even now, when I think back to it, I can almost feel the cold air again and hear the quiet crunch of snow beneath my feet. What happened that day has never had a clear explanation. and maybe that is why it stayed with me so strongly. It happened during the winter sometime in the 1990s while I was snowshoeing in the forests near a small town in northeastern Oregon. The area was remote and sparsely populated, surrounded by thick forests that stretched for miles. It was the kind of place where nature still felt wild and untouched, where you could walk for hours without seeing another person. People who love the outdoors often visit that region because the scenery is beautiful, but there is also something about those forests that can feel heavy and mysterious, especially during the winter months. That morning I had decided to go out early. I remember leaving just as the sun was beginning to rise. The sky had that pale winter color, where the light looks soft and almost silver through the trees. The air was cold enough that every breath felt sharp in my lungs, but it was also incredibly clean and refreshing. Winter mornings like that can feel peaceful in a way that is hard to describe. A fresh snowfall had come through the night before. By the time I started my walk, about 4 inches of light powder covered the ground on top of the older snowpack beneath it. Altogether, the snow was nearly 2 feet deep in most places. Everything looked completely white, like someone had laid a soft blanket across the entire forest. The branches of the tall trees were heavy with snow, bending slightly under the weight. One of the most beautiful things about being in the woods after a snowfall is the quiet. Snow absorbs sound, so the world becomes incredibly still. Every movement feels softer. Normally when you walk through a forest, you hear birds calling, squirrels rustling through leaves, or wind moving gently through branches. But after fresh snow, those sounds often disappear. That morning, the quiet felt deeper than usual. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. I was focused on the trail I was making with my snowshoes and enjoying the peaceful surroundings. Each step made a steady crunching sound as the wide frames of the snowshoes pressed into the powder and packed it down beneath me. My breathing formed little clouds of mist in the cold air. As I continued deeper into the forest, though, I started to notice something odd. The silence was absolute. There were no bird calls anywhere, no distant movement of animals through the brush. Even the wind seemed to have disappeared completely. The trees stood perfectly still, their branches frozen in place. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of silence that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. At first, I tried to ignore the feeling. When you spend enough time outdoors, you know that forests sometimes go through periods of stillness. Animals move away, the wind dies down, and everything becomes calm. But as I walked farther along, something about the atmosphere began to feel unsettling. There was a strange tension in the air that I couldn't explain. Slowly, that uncomfortable feeling started to grow stronger. It was that instinctive sensation that many people have experienced at some point in their lives. The feeling that you are not alone, even when you cannot see anyone around you. It's hard to describe because it doesn't come from something obvious like a sound or movement. It comes from somewhere deeper, almost like your instincts are warning you that something isn't right. The hair on the back of my neck began to stand up. I started glancing around more often as I walked. My eyes moved between the tall trees, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. But every direction looked the same. Just endless trees, snow-covered branches, and untouched white ground. There was nothing there, at least nothing visible. Still, that strange feeling of being watched refused to go away. If anything, it seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. The deeper I went into the forest, the more uneasy I felt. Eventually, I decided that it might be a good idea to head back toward my car. In winter, it's always wise to be careful about time and distance when you're traveling alone. I had already walked several miles by that point. Snowshoeing through deep snow takes energy, and the farther you go, the more important it becomes to keep track of your surroundings and your strength. So I stopped walking and turned around. That was the moment everything changed. Behind me, following the trail I had been making through the snow, was another set of footprints. For a second, I honestly thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I stared at the snow, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the longer I looked, the clearer it became. Those prints were not mine. They were the size and shape of human footprints, and they were positioned directly behind the path I had been walking. My stomach dropped the instant I realized what I was looking at. The first thought that ran through my mind was simple and terrifying. Someone had been walking behind me, but that made absolutely no sense. The snow was deep. When you walk through snow that deep, every step makes a loud crunching sound. It is impossible to move quietly. If another person had been following me along the trail, even from a distance, I would have heard them. But I hadn't heard anything, not a single sound. I stepped carefully off to the side so I wouldn't disturb the prints and leaned down to get a closer look. That was when I noticed the next strange detail. The footprints were only pressed into the snow a couple of inches. That alone didn't make sense. My own snowshoes had been sinking deeply into the snowpack with every step. That's the whole reason people wear snowshoes in deep snow, to spread out their weight so they don't sink even farther. Yet these prints looked as though they barely touched the surface. Whoever or whatever had made them should have sunk much deeper into the snow. But they hadn't. I kept examining them, trying to understand what I was seeing. Then another detail stood out that made the entire situation even more disturbing. There was only one footprint, just a right foot. No left footprint anywhere. The single right print appeared every so often along my trail. Each one was spaced roughly 10 feet apart from the next. They followed directly behind the line of my own snowshoe tracks, as though something had been trailing me step for step. Except it wasn't walking normally. It looked like something had taken one step, then disappeared, and then appeared again 10 feet farther along to leave another single right print. I stood there in the cold forest, staring down at the snow, trying to force my mind to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe the snow had shifted in a strange way. Maybe an animal had left tracks that only looked human. But the shape was unmistakable. They were human footprints, and they were repeating in a pattern that made absolutely no sense. As I looked farther back along the trail, I realized something else that made the situation even more unsettling. The prints didn't come from the surrounding forest. There were no tracks entering the trail from the trees, no path crossing mine, nothing. My snowshoe tracks stretched back into the forest exactly as I had left them. Then suddenly, at one point behind me, the first single footprint appeared, as if it had simply materialized. It looked like something had stepped out of nowhere. The prints continued behind me for a short distance, spaced out every several feet. Then they stopped completely near the spot where I had turned around. After that point, there were no more prints at all. I slowly lifted my head and looked around the forest again. Everything looked exactly the same as it had before. The trees stood tall and silent. The snow-covered ground stretched out in every direction. The forest was completely still, but now that silence felt heavier than before. It felt like something had been there, watching me, following me. And for reasons I still cannot understand, it stopped the moment I turned around. After a few moments, I forced myself to start walking back toward the direction of my car. Every step felt tense. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see another print appear behind me or hear something moving through the trees. But nothing else happened. The forest remained silent for the entire walk back. When I finally reached the road and my car, I felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't until I was driving away from the area that my mind started replaying what I had seen again and again. Over the years, I have tried to come up with explanations for those footprints. Maybe the snow had formed unusual impressions from melting and freezing. Maybe there was some natural cause that I simply failed to recognize in the moment. But no explanation has ever fully made sense. Every time I think back to that morning, the same question returns. What in the world was following me? Thank you for spending your night with me. I hope these lullabies stay with you, but not too close. If you found these stories chilling, please like the video and subscribe to join the family. Every comment and sub helps us keep the darkness growing. Get as comfortable as you can, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Sweet dreams.